My father called the morning after my brother's wedding, the one I wasn't invited to. Be a good daughter, he said. Send the key to your resort. It's their honeymoon. I said nothing, but while they unpacked their bags in Pasadena, I sent them something else. A wedding gift that exposed every secret they thought I'd never find. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. May, in Malibu, has a way of making everything look softer than it really is. The sunlight spilled across the wide glass windows of my office, catching the polished edges of the design sketches spread over my desk. Outside, the Pacific murmured steady and endless brushing against the private cove that made Ocean View Resort feel like its own small kingdom, my peace. Until the phone rang. Dad, the screen read. I froze for a beat, my hand hovering above the phone, that old reflex of hesitation I could never quite kill. Then I answered. His voice came through like the sound of a door slamming. Olivia, your brother just got married. Send the keys to the resort. They'll be staying there for their honeymoon. I blinked. The words didn't land right. Married honeymoon. No one had called. No one had told me there was even a wedding. When I asked quietly, last weekend, he said as if it were nothing. It was small, private. You know how Ethan is. There was a rustle of papers on his end, the kind of distracted noise that told me I wasn't really part of this conversation. Don't make this complicated, Olivia. That house belongs to the family. Ethan and his wife need some privacy after the wedding. My hand tightened around the phone. You mean my resort? I said. But he talked right over me. I'll have someone pick up the keys tomorrow. Just make sure the place is ready. I'll think about it, I said. Think about it. Olivia, this isn't... I hung up before he could finish. For a long moment, I didn't move. The only sound was the ocean beyond the balcony, steady and unbothered. I stared at the phone at the faint reflection of my own face in the dark screen. My chest felt tight, not angry, yet not exactly hurt. Just the familiar weight of being invisible to the people who were supposed to see me first. I stood, walked to the window, and poured myself a glass of Sauvignon Blanc from the bottle I'd opened the night before. The cool air slid in from the sea, carrying the faint smell of salt and jasmine. I raised the glass to my lips, hoping it would taste like calm. It didn't. The world outside was bright and blue and cruelly beautiful. I unlocked my phone and opened Instagram. My brother's name was easy to find. Ethan Hartley, attorney at Henson & Price, recently married to Sienna Reed. Their wedding photos were everywhere. The ceremony had taken place in Napa Valley under an archway of white roses and fairy lights. My parents stood at the center of every picture. Dad looking proud. Mom radiant. Ethan grinning beside a woman I'd never met. Sienna's smile was movie star perfect, all teeth and confidence. My brother captioned one photo. A day I'll never forget. Thank you, family, for making it perfect. Family. I wasn't tagged. I scrolled slower this time. Photo after photo. Every detail perfectly curated the vineyard backdrop, the champagne tower, the dancing under string lights. I stopped when I saw my mother's post. Our hearts are full tonight. So proud of our son. There were hundreds of comments congratulating them. My name didn't appear once. I took another sip of wine and leaned against the window frame. They call me the eldest daughter, I murmured, but I've never had a place in that family. The words slipped out before I could stop them. Hearing them aloud made them real. The tide rolled in the same rhythm it had kept for centuries. I had built this place with my own hands, with years of labor, and a spine stiffened by silence. I'd poured everything into Ocean View. My savings, my sleepless nights, my stubborn belief that I could make something beautiful without their permission. And now they wanted it just like that. I walked back to my desk, pushed the sketches aside, and sat down. My pulse had settled into something calmer, colder. I opened my laptop and refreshed my email. There it was. A new message from the front desk. Subject, early access request. Body. Mr. Edward Hartley requested early access for Mr. Ethan Hartley and wife next week. A small laugh escaped me. The kind of laugh that feels more like exhaling disbelief. I clicked delete the sound of the key pressed sharp in the quiet room. No one walks into my house without asking. I said softly, not anymore. I set the wine glass down the stem, catching the last of the sunlight. The waves outside grew louder as the tide shifted, pushing harder against the shore. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, a single harsh note that faded into the wind. I stood there for a while, watching the ocean reclaim the sand, and thought about the last time my father had said he was proud of me. I couldn't remember when that was. Maybe he never had. The phone buzzed again. A new message flashed across the screen. Mom this time. I didn't open it. Whatever excuse she'd written, I didn't need to hear it. Instead, I turned off the phone, finished the wine, and let the silence close around me. Outside, the Pacific kept moving, unstoppable, endless, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small in its shadow. I felt ready. Boston, 2010. The dining room in our family home still smelled faintly of lemon polish and old pride. My graduation cap sat on the table beside the half-empty wine glasses, a forgotten symbol of something I thought might finally make my father proud. He cut his steak into perfect squares the same way he always did when preparing to lecture someone. I've been thinking I began my voice too careful about starting a small design studio here in Boston, maybe in South End. I've already spoken with a few classmates about renting a space. Dad didn't even look up. Running a business is hard, Olivia. You don't have the temperament for it. He chewed, swallowed, and dabbed his mouth with a napkin. That kind of risk is for men who can handle pressure. Mom's fork paused halfway to her mouth, but she said nothing. Ethan, 19, and full of the kind of confidence only sons are born into, smirked across the table. Your brother, Dad continued, was just accepted into pre-law. Bright future ahead. We'll help him get a place near campus, maybe even buy it outright. A good environment matters. My pulse thudded once hard. I forced a smile, the kind that hides disappointment behind politeness. That's great news. Dad finally met my eyes. You should find something steady, Olivia. A design firm, maybe. Get experience, then settle down. You'll thank me later. I nodded, though the words felt like lead in my throat. That night, I packed my sketchbooks, my diploma, and my disappointment, and took the train to Los Angeles. The next 5 years blurred together. Paint-stained hands, late nights in small apartments that smelled of dust and coffee. I worked for a boutique design company that paid just enough to keep me breathing. My bosses liked my precision, but not my ideas. Too modern, they said. Too bold. I rented a studio apartment the size of a walk-in closet, and painted the walls white to trick myself into thinking it was bigger. Every month I sent a check home small and pointless just to remind them I existed. Sometimes when exhaustion hit, I'd sketch dream houses. Places filled with light silence and control. Places where no one could tell me what I was capable of. One evening, my phone buzzed while I was varnishing a piece of furniture. It was a group text from Mom, a photo of Ethan standing in front of a newly purchased townhouse in Cambridge. The caption read, "So proud of our boy." First investment property. Hard work pays off. My hands trembled, streaking the varnish. I wiped them on a rag and stared at the screen until the words blurred. When I needed an opportunity, I whispered, they called it a fantasy. When he needed one, they called it an investment. In 2015, the tide turned. I'd saved every dollar eaten ramen more nights than I could count, and finally, standing on the edge of a crumbling estate in Malibu, I saw it. The place that would change everything. The house was a ruin, but the view was pure gold, salt stains on the walls. A staircase half collapsed, the faint echo of the ocean beating against the cliffs below. Most people saw decay. I saw potential. I met the realtor that afternoon, a tanned woman in her 50s, who looked unconvinced. "You're sure you want this property, Ms. Hartley?" "It's been on the market for years. Too remote. Too much work." "That's fine," I said, signing the papers. "I don't mind work." I named it Ocean View before the paint was even dry. I rebuilt everything. Ripped out the walls myself, sketched blueprints by hand, hired local contractors who believed in what I was doing. When the money ran out, I refinanced my car and slept on a cot in one of the finished rooms. 2 years later, Ocean View Resort opened its doors. The first night I stood on the terrace in a simple black dress, watching the light spill across the sea. Guests laughed over champagne. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd created something that couldn't be taken from me. My parents came for the ribbon cutting. Dad wore his best suit. Mom insisted on taking photos with the staff. When the cameras flashed, he leaned toward me and said, "It's beautiful, Liv, but you should let Ethan help manage it. A man's touch will make it last." I smiled for the photographers, the glass of champagne trembling just slightly in my hand. "I'll think about it, Dad." Later, when the guests were gone, I poured myself another drink and stood under the terrace lights. The sea was black and endless. I told myself his words didn't matter, but the truth was, they always did. Years passed. Ocean View became profitable. Celebrities stayed there. Travel magazines wrote features calling it a minimalist paradise with the soul of its creator. I never told my father about the awards. He wouldn't have cared. In 2023, I sat in the same office where I'd once answered his call and scrolled through the morning headlines. Hartley Realty under federal investigation for loan fraud and mismanagement. My father's name was everywhere. Accusations, interviews, speculation. For a moment, I stared at the screen, the irony washing over me like cold water. The man who'd built his empire on control was losing it to chaos. I closed the laptop, exhaled slowly, and looked out the window. The ocean was calm that day, glassy and still. Funny, I said softly, how some people never realize what's truly theirs until it's gone. The sound of waves filled the silence that followed, steady as breathing. I didn't smile, but I didn't feel sorry either. The world was simply returning the balance he'd upset long ago. The Hartley estate in Pasadena had always looked like a museum, pretending to be a home. Every corner polished, every painting chosen meant to whisper the same story. We are perfect. We are powerful. We are untouched. From the video stream glowing on my laptop that night, I could see nothing had changed. Nothing had. The chandeliers glimmered like stars, the wine flowed freely, and everyone smiled a little too wide. The anchor on the local news called it a private celebration for one of Pasadena's most respected families. The camera lingered on the gates, the roses, the laughter. There was my father, Edward Hartley, shaking hands with city officials, and my mother, Margaret, arranging flowers on a table already overflowing with them. Her lips moved. Though I couldn't hear her, I knew the words by heart. Everything must be perfect. No one will say we've lost our touch. I watched them toast. Ethan stood beside his bride, Sienna, who gleamed in ivory silk like she'd been born for this family portrait. Her smile was pure performance, the kind that draws attention but hides intention. My parents looked radiant beside them, basking in reflected glory. My name was never mentioned. I took another sip of coffee gone cold and muted the video. The silence that followed felt louder than the laughter I'd just heard. There was a time I would have told myself it was a misunderstanding, that maybe the invitation had been lost, that maybe my father just forgot to tell me. But there was no maybe anymore. They hadn't forgotten me. They had erased me. I turned off the laptop, but the reflection of that party stayed in my mind. Champagne smiles. Sienna's hand resting possessively on Ethan's arm. I remembered the way my father used to introduce us to guests when we were kids. This is Ethan, my son, the future of the Hartley legacy. And this, a pause, is Olivia, our creative one. It had always felt like a compliment dipped in dismissal. The phone rang. Mom's name flashed on the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won. Olivia. She said, her tone already apologetic. Please don't be upset about tonight. Upset, I said, leaning back in my chair. You mean about not being invited to my own brother's wedding? You know how your father is. He wanted something simple, private. He's been under so much stress, and with his heart. Simple. I cut in. There were 200 people, Mom. And a film crew. Silence. Then softly. He just wants peace. Liv. You know how easily he gets worked up. Don't give him another reason to. I laughed once, quietly. Peace. Is that what you call pretending your daughter doesn't exist? Please don't talk like that. Her voice trembled. Your father's trying. He just doesn't know how to handle you sometimes. Handle me, I repeated. You mean I don't fit the picture? She said nothing. For a second, I imagined her in that perfect dining room, clutching the phone like it might burn her. I could almost see her eyes darting toward my father, making sure he didn't overhear. I have to go, she whispered finally. Get some rest. The line went dead. For a long while, I sat there staring out at the ocean beyond my window. The waves were restless that night, white foam flashing under the moonlight. I could still hear the echo of music through my computer speakers. Perfect family, perfect son, perfect life. When my phone buzzed again, I almost ignored it. This time, it was Lydia, my resort manager. Her voice came through low and hesitant. Liv, sorry to bother you so late. I just got a call from a Mr. Edward Hartley. He said he wanted to book Ocean View for Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Hartley. Honeymoon stay next week. The laugh that slipped out of me startled even me. He did he? Lydia hesitated. Should I confirm? No, I said. Absolutely not. No one steps into this resort without my approval. Not even him. Understood? She said, though, her tone carried the weight of someone who knew she'd just witnessed the start of something dangerous. After I hung up, I poured a glass of whiskey this time. The burn was clean sharp. I let it slide down slow, grounding me. From my office window, I could see the faint reflection of myself. The cool, composed version of me I'd learned to wear like armor. But under that surface, something else stirred. Not anger exactly, something steadier. Across the city, I imagined my father in his study, the way he always looked when no one was watching. Shoulders heavy, a glass of scotch beside him, the weight of his empire pressing against his chest. He'd built everything on appearances, the house, the business, the son. And now, as his debts grew and his health faltered, I knew he was telling himself the same lie he'd always told. Just one more deal, one more sale, and everything would be fine. I could almost hear him whispering it to himself. If I can just sell that property, it'll all be okay. He meant my resort, my life's work. Outside, the waves crashed harder, as if echoing the thought I couldn't quite say aloud. They'd taken my place in the family, and now they wanted the one thing that was truly mine. I set down the glass and turned off the lights. The resort lights shimmered across the water, a line of gold cutting through the darkness. I stood there a long time listening to the ocean breathe. It sounded like warning, or maybe a promise. When I finally walked upstairs, I felt strangely calm. I'd spent years thinking I had to earn their respect to prove something, but tonight, watching them celebrate without me, I understood the truth. You can't lose what was never yours to begin with, and if they wanted my resort, they'd have to come for it themselves. The living room was quiet, except for the hum of the ocean outside. The clock had passed midnight, but sleep felt like a language I'd forgotten. I sat on the couch with my laptop open, scrolling through the endless photos from Ethan's wedding. There she was, Sienna Reed, now Sienna Hartley. Her face caught the light in every frame, confident, flawless, the kind of beauty that knew it was being watched. She stood beside my brother like she already belonged there. Something in her expression tugged at my memory. I zoomed in on one photo, her smile, the slight tilt of her head. I'd seen that smile before, and then it clicked. A year earlier, she'd come to Ocean View as part of a coastal luxury travel event. Back then, her name hadn't meant anything to me. She was just another influencer with perfect hair and too much perfume asking for the best angles to take her photos by the infinity pool. I remembered her standing in the lobby, sunlight slicing across the marble floor. This resort is gorgeous, she'd said, spinning slowly to take it all in. If you ever think of selling, I bet it would go for a fortune. I'd smiled politely the way you do with guests who say things they don't understand. I don't sell what I built with my own hands. She'd laughed lightly like I'd told a joke. Everything has a price. And now there she was again. Back in my life, wearing my family's name. I stared at her face on the screen for a long time, the champagne-colored dress, the flawless makeup. My brother had always been drawn to women like that. Pretty ambitious, a little dangerous. The kind who saw his last name as a door they wanted to open. But this time it wasn't just about him. I minimized the photo and opened a browser tab, typing Sienna Reed into the search bar. The results flooded in immediately. Lifestyle blogger, brand ambassador, influencer. Her website was polished, too polished. Her bio described her as a creative visionary collaborating with global luxury partners. Her latest post featured her standing in front of a hotel logo I recognized. Summit Horizons Group. My stomach tightened. I clicked through the link, Summit Horizons. Expanding Coastal Development Malibu 2024. The logo shimmered on the page, sleek and modern. I'd seen it before, on documents my father had left lying around his office during my last visit a lifetime ago. So that's what this was, not coincidence. A plan. I leaned back on the couch, the pieces falling into place faster than I could breathe. Voiceover, if anyone had been there to hear it. She found her way back through a door carved with my family's name. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't used in years. Daniel Avery. Private investigator, the kind of man who didn't ask questions until after he already had answers. He picked up on the third ring, his voice rough with sleep. Olivia Hartley. That's a surprise. Sorry to wake you, I said, though I didn't mean it. I need a file. On someone named Sienna Reed Hartley. I want everything. Background, financials, business ties. He grunted. That's specific. There's more, I continued. If my father's connected to a company called Summit Horizons, I need to know how deep, before he does something that can't be undone. The sound of papers shuffled on the other end. You think he's in trouble? I think he's trying to drag me into it, I said. A pause. Then his tone sharpened. What exactly do you want me to find? Proof. I said quietly. Whatever they're hiding, and Daniel, if it leads back to him, I want to know before anyone else does. He exhaled. You always did have a thing for secrets. No, I said. I have a thing for truth. When I hung up, the silence rushed back in heavier than before. I stared at the laptop screen, the glow painting my reflection pale and unfamiliar. I'd spent years building this resort from nothing, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. And now my father was trying to sell it out from under me, using my brother's marriage as camouflage. 2 days later, an email arrived from Daniel. The subject line was short, found something. Found. My hand hesitated for a moment before I clicked. Attached was a file, a single-page summary with photos, and a list of names. At the top, Summit Horizons Group, current negotiations, coastal acquisitions, Malibu sector, and just below it, primary representative Peter Lawson. I knew that name. My father's old friend, the one who'd stood beside him at my mother's charity galas, who'd sent Ethan expensive watches every Christmas. A man who always smiled too much when he talked about opportunity. Daniel had written one final note at the bottom of the email. FYI, Lawson and Summit are negotiating to purchase a specific beachfront property registered under Ocean View Resort LLC. I'm guessing that's yours. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. So this was the plan. Ethan's marriage wasn't about love. Sienna was the bridge, the charming new daughter-in-law sent to get close to persuade to soften me into compliance. And my father, ever the strategist, had chosen the perfect pawn. The ocean roared outside the window louder than usual, as if echoing my pulse. They think I'll stay quiet, I said aloud, like my mother always did. I closed the laptop, the sound sharp in the stillness. My reflection in the glass looked calm, almost serene, but inside I could feel it, the slow rising certainty that whatever came next, they wouldn't see it coming. The morning air in Pasadena felt too clean, too polite for the kind of conversation I was about to have. The Hartley house stood as it always had, immaculate, intimidating, with the faint smell of jasmine and control. I parked in the circular driveway, stared at the front door for a moment, and then went in. My mother was arranging flowers in the living room when I entered. She froze, mid-motion, petals trembling between her fingers. Olivia, she said, her voice too bright. What a surprise. Dad was sitting on the couch reading the financial section of the Times, glasses low on his nose. He didn't look up right away. So you finally decided to show your face. I thought we should talk, I said, taking the armchair across from him. He folded the paper with a sharp snap. Talk. You ignored your brother's wedding. You embarrassed this family. And now you think you can just walk in here like nothing happened? I kept my tone even. How much do you owe, Dad? That got his attention. He blinked once, slow. What did you just say? I asked. I repeated how much debt you're in. He leaned forward, voice tightening. Where did you hear that? It doesn't matter, I said, sliding a manila folder from my bag and setting it on the coffee table. The edge of the file caught the morning light. What matters is that if I hadn't found out, Ocean View would already be on the list of properties Summit Horizons plans to buy out. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in. My mother's hands dropped from the vase petals, scattering onto the rug. Dad's jaw tightened. You've been digging into things that don't concern you. That's dangerous. Dangerous, I asked. For who? He stood abruptly, pacing toward the window. You have no idea what you're talking about. Summit Horizons is helping me restructure assets. It's business. You wouldn't understand. I tilted my head, calm on the surface, furious underneath. So selling my resort is just business. His back stiffened. Before he could answer, Mom spoke softly. Olivia. Your father's trying to fix things. Summit has the resources. They could help clear the company's debts. You should be proud he's doing what's necessary. I turned to her. And when they take Ocean View, Mom, what will I have left? Pride. Her eyes darted to Dad, then back to me. You don't understand. This isn't about you. I laughed, the sound sharp. It's always about him, isn't it? Dad turned his expression a warning. You've built a little hotel, Olivia. That's all it is. Don't overestimate your importance. The words landed like glass shattering. I swallowed the sting. That little hotel is the only thing in this family that isn't drowning in lies. Before he could respond, the house phone rang, an old-fashioned sound that somehow made the moment worse. Mom moved toward it, but Dad raised a hand. Leave it. The ringing stopped, then started again. I crossed the room, picked up the receiver before either of them could protest. Hello? A smooth voice slid through the line. You shouldn't have done that, Olivia. I recognized her immediately. Sienna. Your father's under enough stress, she said lightly, as though this were a social call. You're only making things worse. Maybe it's time you stopped fighting and let him handle this. Handle it, I asked. You mean sell off my work to save his empire? There was a short pause, the faint hum of static between us. You're making the family look bad. You don't want to be the reason your father collapses, do you? I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I'm just doing what he taught me, Sienna. Protecting what's mine. Dad snatched the phone from my hand. That's enough. He snapped into the receiver. I'll call you later. He slammed it down, his breathing loud in the quiet room. When he turned back to me, his face had gone red. You have no respect. None. You come here, throw accusations, humiliate your mother. I brought facts, I interrupted. Not accusations. He slammed his palm against the table, the sound cracking through the room. You think you're saving something, but you're destroying everything. This family, this name. Your arrogance will ruin it all. I stood, feeling the tremor of fury run through me, but my voice stayed steady. No, Dad. I learned this from you. Never trust the people who say they love you, while they're cutting you out of every decision. His lips parted, but no words came out. Mom looked between us, pale, trembling, as though she were watching something she'd always feared finally happen. I took my bag from the chair. If you sell Geese's Ocean View, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what Summit Horizons is buying. And why? You wouldn't dare, he said. I met his eyes. Watch me. For a long moment, none of us moved. The only sound was the faint tick of the grandfather clock and the whisper of the sprinkler outside watering grass that never seemed to die. Then I turned and walked out the front door, closing softly behind me. As I stepped into the sunlight, I realized my hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from the strange rush of clarity that comes when you finally stop pretending a wound isn't there. Behind me through the glass, I could see my father sink into his chair, pressing a hand to his chest. My mother knelt beside him, whispering something I couldn't hear. I got in my car and started the engine. The air smelled like orange blossoms and smoke. For the first time, I didn't look back. Ruth Miller's office looked like the kind of place where justice came with coffee and a paper trail. The glass walls reflected the skyline of downtown Los Angeles, sharp and golden in the morning sun. I sat across from her desk, trying to ignore the tremor in my hands, as she unrolled a large document across the table. A legal map, intricate and cold. This, she said, tapping her pen on the papers, is the cleanest way to protect what's yours. If we move Ocean View into a charitable trust under your foundation, no one can sell it, transfer it, or use it as collateral. Not your father, not Summit Horizons, not anyone. Make it happen. I said, she gave me a long look, Olivia. Once we file this, it's irreversible. The property won't belong to you personally anymore. It'll belong to the foundation. I don't need ownership, I said quietly. I need it safe. She nodded, the hint of admiration flickering in her eyes. I'll have my assistant draft the paperwork immediately. While she typed, I stared at the signature line on the previous form. I'd signed my name thousands of times. Contracts, designs, approvals. But this felt different. Final. My hand hovered for a second before I pressed the pen down. When the ink dried, a strange calm settled in my chest. Ocean View wasn't just a resort anymore. It was untouchable. By afternoon, Daniel called. His voice carried that clipped energy that meant he had something I wouldn't like. Your sister-in-law, he began. She's busy. I turned toward the window. Define busy. Lunch meeting. Beverly Grove. Peter Lawson. My stomach tightened. Tell me everything. I'm tailing them now, he said. She's confident. Overconfident. Through the phone, I could hear snippets of conversation, cutlery clinking, muffled laughter, the hum of a restaurant alive with people who had no idea they were sitting beside deceit. Edward will sign. Sienna was saying, her voice smooth as silk. He just needs a little push. Once I have a copy of Olivia's signature, Lawson can handle the paperwork. No one will know until it's done. Lawson chuckled. You're sure she'll take the bait? She'll resist. Sienna replied, but that's why I have Ethan. He'll get her to lower her guard, Daniel whispered. Got it all recorded. When he sent the file later that night, I listened to it twice, once with disbelief, the second time with a quiet, deliberate fury. There she was, plotting to forge my name using my brother as a pawn, and my father, the man who once lectured me about integrity, standing somewhere in the wings ready to sign whatever kept his empire alive. Good work, I told Daniel. Keep following Lawson. I want to know where the paperwork moves. He hesitated. You're not planning to go to the cops yet, are you? Not yet, I said. First, I need them to see what they've done, to look me in the eye when the truth hits. He exhaled. Understood. When I hung up, the sky outside was fading into violet. The resort's lights came alive one by one, spilling gold across the sand. I sat there for a long time, thinking of all the years I'd spent trying to earn their approval, mistaking silence for peace. My phone rang again. Mom. I answered on the third ring. Olivia. She began, already pleading. Please don't make this worse. Your father's exhausted. He's just trying to save what he built. I turned toward the open balcony doors, letting the sea wind drown out her voice for a moment. Save, I repeated. He's selling pieces of everyone who ever loved him, and calling it salvation. You don't understand, she said softly. Sometimes you have to compromise to survive. I closed my eyes. Maybe. But sometimes you have to burn it down before it kills you. She went silent. The kind of silence that came from someone realizing they'd lost the power to persuade. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. You sound just like your father. No, I said. I sound like someone who finally stopped believing him. After she hung up, I stayed by the window, staring at the black horizon, where the sky met the water. The wind lifted my hair salty and wild. The sound of the ocean was relentless, rhythmic, as if echoing the truth I'd buried for years. I went to the filing cabinet in the corner of my office. The steel drawer slid open with a groan. Inside were years of paperwork, permits, contracts, legal drafts. I pulled out a thick envelope I'd prepared that morning, the one labeled in neat handwriting. For the wedding. Inside were copies of every document Daniel had sent. Emails, transaction records, photographs. Even a printed transcript of Sienna's meeting. Proof of everything they thought they could hide. I slipped in one more sheet. The new deed showing Ocean View's transfer to the trust sealed with Ruth's signature and mine. I sealed the envelope and laid it flat on my desk, pressing my palm against it for a moment. For years, I'd lived my life reacting, absorbing their choices, cleaning their messes, pretending their betrayals were misunderstandings. But not this time. This time, I wasn't just the daughter they ignored. I was the woman who finally learned when to stop enduring. The ocean roared again, outside steady and certain. I looked out into the night, my reflection merging with the dark glass, and whispered, You wanted my signature, Sienna. You'll get it. Just not the way you planned. Then I turned off the lights, leaving the envelope on the desk ready for delivery. The morning air at Ocean View was sharp and salt-sweet, the kind that woke you without mercy. I sat at the long oak table in my office, sleeves rolled to my elbows, hair tied back, a mug of coffee cooling beside me. In front of me sat a small silver gift box, the kind you'd see in a glossy magazine ad, polished, elegant, harmless. Inside it was anything but. I laid each item carefully into place the way you would arrange a memory you didn't want to forget. First, the USB drive. Daniel's recording of Sienna and Peter Lawson's conversation at Beverly Grove. Her voice clear, confident, damning. Then the copy of the forged transfer contract complete with my falsified signature. And finally a note I'd written in blue ink. A small gift to wish you a perfectly honest marriage. I tied the satin ribbon slowly, the silver catching the early light. My pulse was steady. This wasn't revenge. It was disclosure. A truth they'd built themselves wrapped neatly by me. I called the courier service, gave the address of my father's Pasadena estate, and handed the package to the driver with the kind of calm that only comes after every nerve has already burned. "Deliver it by noon," I said. "Signature required." When he left, I stood for a moment on the terrace, looking out at the horizon. The Pacific shimmered like glass. It was beautiful, unbothered. It didn't care what storms people made on land. By noon, the package was gone. Across the city, I imagined my father in his office. Papers spread across his desk, the weight of his empire pressing down on him. I could almost hear him talking into the phone the way he always did when he was trying to sound in control. "Lawson," he'd say, "you told me it was settled. They were supposed to sign. I need the payment by the end of the month or we're done." And Lawson, oily as ever, would reassure him. "Relax, Edward. Everything's under control. These things take time." But they wouldn't, not after today. As the sun slid lower, painting the ocean in streaks of gold and copper, I poured myself a glass of Chardonnay and went upstairs to the rooftop terrace. The wind was stronger up there, tugging strands of hair loose from my tie. I'd always loved that sound. The rush of air, the steady pulse of waves below. It reminded me of all the things I couldn't control, and all the things I'd finally stopped trying to. The phone rang. I let it ring once, twice before answering. "Olivia." My mother's voice came through, jagged, breathless. "What did you do?" I swirled the wine in my glass. "You'll have to be more specific. The recordings. Everyone's heard them. Your father." "Oh my God, your father. Reporters are calling clients. There's a video online. They're saying the company forged property contracts." I listened, silent except for the faint sound of the sea behind me. "Do you understand what you've done?" she shouted. "You've destroyed him." I took a sip of wine. "I didn't destroy him, Mom. I just stopped covering for him." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, shaky, uneven. "You don't know what this will do to our family." "Actually," I said softly, "I do." Her voice broke. "He's sick, Olivia. His heart can't." "I warned him," I said. "I begged him not to sell what wasn't his to sell." He chose to ignore me. Another pause, then a quiet, desperate whisper. "Please, don't make this worse." I let out a slow breath. "It's already done, Mom. I just sent a wedding gift." Before she could answer, I ended the call. I stood there for a while, the phone heavy in my hand, the sky burning itself out into red and purple. From the terrace, I could see the world in every direction. Endless ocean, one way, the glowing sprawl of Los Angeles the other. Somewhere between them, my family's name was turning to ash. Later that evening, I went downstairs and turned on the TV. The local news had cut into regular programming. The headline running across the screen read, "Hartley Realty, under investigation for contract fraud." The camera showed my father outside his office, surrounded by reporters, flashes bursting like gunfire. He looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, skin gray under the camera lights. He tried to push through the crowd, but microphones followed him like vultures. "Mr. Hartley, did you authorize falsified property transfers? Are the allegations true? Was your daughter aware of the scheme?" He said nothing. For once, the man who always had an answer couldn't find a single word. I muted the sound and watched the images move in silence. There was something almost peaceful about it. The chaos he'd created finally turning back on him, like the tide reclaiming what never belonged on land. I sat back in the chair, raised my glass, and watched him disappear into a waiting car. The ribbon from the gift box still lay on my desk, glimmering in the dim light. "Congratulations on the wedding," I murmured the words, tasting like salt and steel. "May it be as honest as you are." Outside, the waves rolled in steady and unbroken, carrying away whatever was left of the old world. I'd finally stopped trying to fix. By morning, Los Angeles was buzzing like a hive cracked open. Every screen, every headline, every voice carried my family's name. Hartley Realty scandal. Contract fraud allegations. Rock prominent Pasadena family. The words crawled across the ticker at the bottom of every financial network. Talk show hosts dissected the story like vultures circling a carcass. Reporters camped outside the Pasadena estate, cameras waiting for blood. I didn't have to imagine my father's reaction. I knew it by heart. The raised voice, the slammed fists, the command to fix it, always directed at people who couldn't. But this time no one could. In his downtown office, Edward Hartley, the man who once terrified boardrooms, was unraveling. Papers scattered across the floor. He shouted at his assistant, threw a folder across the room, then pressed a trembling hand to his chest. His bottle of heart medication rolled across the desk as he slumped into the leather chair. When power is all a man knows. How to hold my voice murmured in memory. Losing, it is a kind of death. Across town in the house where I grew up, my mother sat at the kitchen counter, surrounded by phones that wouldn't stop ringing. She cried quietly between calls the way women cry when they're ashamed to admit they're afraid. Edward, don't read anymore, she whispered into the empty air. They've printed everything, even the investigation files. Back at Ocean View, the morning light fell cold through the lobby windows. The resort was unusually still. Guests had checked out early, spooked by the headlines. I walked the empty hallway, heels clicking softly against the marble, the ocean outside gray and restless. Lydia found me near the entrance, a clipboard clutched in her hands. You okay, Liv? I gave her a small smile. Fine. Her brow furrowed. The press keeps calling. They want to know if we're releasing a statement. When the truth comes out, I said people will call it a scandal. That's how they hide from accountability. She nodded slowly, unsure if I wanted comfort or silence. I didn't want either. Later that afternoon, I stood by the window of my office, watching the tide pull back. The phone on my desk rang once, twice, and I ignored it, until I saw the name flash across the screen. Ethan. I let it go to voicemail. Then, 20 minutes later, tires crunched against the gravel outside. I knew that sound. My brother. He stormed into the lobby, still in his designer suit, tie-loosened face flushed from anger and humiliation. What the hell did you do? He shouted. I didn't flinch. Good afternoon to you, too. You've destroyed them, he said, his voice cracking. Mom hasn't stopped crying. And Dad, he can't even leave the house. The company's finished. You've ruined everything. I met his eyes. I didn't ruin anything, Ethan. I exposed it. There's a difference. He took a step closer, jaw tight. You've always hated them, hated me. Admit it. This was payback. I shook my head. I don't hate you, Ethan, but you've spent your whole life pretending not to see what they are. Now the world sees it too. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. You think you're some hero? You humiliated Dad in front of the entire city. You could have handled this quietly, but no, you needed your big moment, didn't you? I turned away, walking toward the terrace. The ocean wind cut through the tension, cool and sharp. I don't need moments, Ethan. I needed the truth to breathe. He followed me, voice rising. Sienna loves me, you know. She's nothing like what you think. I stopped, the name hitting me like a stone skipping across still water. Slowly, I turned back to him. Loves you, yes, he said, desperate now. She stood by me when no one else did. She believes in this family. I let out a soft, almost pitying laugh. Then maybe you should ask your loving wife how she knew the exact security code to this resort before you ever brought her here. His face froze, confusion clouding the anger. What are you talking about? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. The same code that was in the forged contract she helped prepare. The same access code she gave Lawson to prove I'd agreed to sell. You think that was love? He blinked, words caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. I leaned in slightly. Ask her where she learned it. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then he turned, shoulders stiff, and walked out. The sound of his car engine echoed through the still air as he sped down the drive. I stood on the terrace, the wind whipping at my hair. Somewhere below, the waves crashed against the rocks, relentless, unstoppable. Inside, the phone rang again. Press, lawyers, reporters, it didn't matter. I let it ring. Through the glass, I caught my reflection, steady, unflinching. For the first time in years, I didn't see the obedient daughter or the forgotten sister. I saw the woman who'd stopped waiting for permission. The city could keep its headlines, my family their outrage. I had given them truth, and truth was a kind of fire. Once lit, it didn't ask for forgiveness. I turned off the lights and let the sound of the ocean fill the silence. The night air in Malibu was thick with salt and silence. From the terrace, I could see the faint shimmer of the Pacific stretching endlessly into the dark. A single lamp glowed beside me, casting a small pool of gold across the table. I'd been sitting there for hours, letting the quiet settle, when headlights appeared at the gate below. For a moment, I thought it was Ethan again. But when the car door opened, I saw my mother's familiar shape, smaller than I remembered, wrapped in a beige coat, moving with the cautious steps of someone carrying something heavier than herself. I rose as she approached, the crunch of gravel under her shoes, sharp against the stillness. In her arms, she held a stack of old envelopes, bound with a rubber band. "Mom." She didn't answer right away. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed red. "I needed to see you," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have come sooner." We sat across from each other at the terrace table. The ocean murmured below, constant, indifferent. She placed the envelopes between us, her hands shaking. "I've kept these for years," she said quietly. "Letters your father wrote to Peter Lawson." I stared at them, the paper yellowed edges soft from time. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because you need to understand," she said. "He's been planning this since 2021. Selling the resort wasn't a desperate decision. It was part of his plan." My stomach tightened. "Show me." She untied the band and handed me the top letter. My father's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, precise, a little arrogant even on paper. I unfolded it carefully, the paper crackling in my hands. "Peter, if things continue this way, I'll transfer Ocean View under your name until the debts are clear. My daughter won't protest. She knows her place." I read it twice, each line cutting deeper. My mother's eyes were wet. "He never meant for you to see those. He always said it was to protect the family, to keep us afloat." I set the letter down slowly. He wasn't protecting the family, Mom. He was protecting himself. She looked away, her voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like, Olivia, to live with a man who's built everything on appearances. I thought if I stayed quiet, if I supported him, maybe it would all hold together. Maybe we'd survive." By pretending nothing was wrong, I asked softly. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "I was scared he'd lose everything. Scared of what people would say. Scared of what would happen to us." I took a deep breath, trying to hold back the anger that wanted to rise. "You chose silence, Mom, and he mistook it for agreement. That's not love. That's surrender." Her face crumpled. "Don't talk to me like I'm your enemy. I'm not." I said, my voice low, but someone had to stop pretending. We sat there, the only sound the waves breaking far below. I picked up another letter, the ink faded, but legible. "If it comes to it, transfer must appear voluntary. Olivia will resist, but she can be managed." The word managed made my throat tighten. Mom's voice was barely audible. "I told him he was wrong. That you wouldn't forgive him. Forgive." I almost laughed. He was ready to sign away everything I built without even telling me. "There's nothing left to forgive." She looked at me, then eyes pleading. "He's your father. No matter what's happened. He's a man who made choices," I said. "And I'm making mine." I stood pacing to the railing, the wind whipping through my hair. The horizon was a long, black line where sea met sky. "You always said you stayed because you didn't want to lose him. But you already did. Years ago. You just didn't admit it." When I turned back, she was crying silently. Her hands clenched around the letters. I walked to her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Mom, I don't want to hurt him, but I can't keep cleaning up his mess. I won't live in the same lie." She looked up, voice barely a whisper. "What are you going to do?" I picked up my phone, dialed Ruth Miller. She answered on the second ring. "Olivia, I have letters," I said, "handwritten from my father to Peter Lawson, proof that he planned the sale years ago. File them with the recordings." Ruth's tone sharpened instantly. "Understood. I'll add them to the submission for the DA's office. Do it tonight." "Are you sure?" I've never been more sure. When I hung up, my mother's eyes were wide with fear. "You're going to destroy him." I shook my head. "He did that himself. I'm just not hiding it anymore." She reached across the table, grabbing my hand. "Please, Liv. He's not strong. His heart." I pulled my hand back gently. "Then maybe it's time he learned what consequences feel like." She looked at me for a long moment, as if seeing someone she didn't recognize. Maybe she was. We sat there in silence, the envelopes lying between us like relics from another life. The wind grew colder, carrying the smell of salt and rain. Somewhere below, the surf grew louder, beating against the shore in slow, rhythmic bursts. For a moment, I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who waited for her father to notice her drawings, who thought silence was safety. That girl was gone now, replaced by someone who finally understood that truth could break things. But lies destroyed them. My mother's shoulders shook as she whispered, "You've just taken everything from him." I looked out toward the dark horizon. "No, Mom. He took it from himself. I just stopped pretending it was worth keeping." Neither of us spoke again. We sat side by side in the half-light, the letters resting on the table between us. The only sound was the steady crash of waves in the distance, pulling the night slowly toward morning. The courthouse smelled faintly of coffee and tension. It was barely 7 a.m., but the halls were already alive, reporters clustering near the entrance, camera flashes cutting through the gray morning light. Every whisper carried my family's name: Hartley, trial, fraud, betrayal. Words that once would have broken me now sounded like freedom. Ruth Miller walked beside me, her heels sharp against the marble. "Don't look at them," she murmured, as a reporter called my name. "They want a reaction. Give them nothing." I nodded, adjusting my coat, the cool air biting at my skin. Across the corridor, I caught sight of my father and Peter Lawson seated outside the courtroom. Edward looked smaller than I remembered, the arrogance drained from him, replaced by something pale and desperate. His suit hung loose on his shoulders. The moment he saw me, his jaw clenched. "Ready?" Ruth asked quietly, more than I thought I'd ever be. I said. We stepped inside. The courtroom was bright, almost blindingly, so sunlight pouring in through the tall windows. At the front, Judge Patricia Lewis sat poised, flipping through the files before her. Rows of spectators lined the benches: journalists, law students, curious strangers drawn by the scent of scandal. When the gavel struck, the noise outside vanished. "Case number 24, C-1784, the clerk read. "Hartley Realty versus Hartley Foundation." I sat still, my hands folded in my lap as Ruth began. Her voice carried the calm precision of someone who had built her life on logic. "Your Honor," she began, "we will show that Edward Hartley and Peter Lawson engaged in fraudulent activity with intent to transfer ownership of the Ocean View property without the consent of its rightful trustee. We will also present direct evidence, including recorded conversations and handwritten correspondence, proving their deliberate intent to deceive." Lawson shifted in his seat, whispering something to his attorney. My father didn't move. He stared straight ahead, his knuckles white around the edge of the table. Ruth continued, introducing the first exhibit, the forged contract, the falsified signature, the recordings. Each piece landed with precision like hammer blows. The courtroom was silent, except for the steady hum of the overhead lights. When the letters appeared on the projector, the ones my mother had handed me on that cold Malibu night, the room seemed to tighten around us. Judge Lewis adjusted her glasses, scanning the page. "These are your father's words," she asked. "Yes, Your Honor." I said, standing. "Written to Mr. Lawson between 2021 and 2023. She nodded. "And you can confirm their authenticity?" "I can." The handwriting was verified by a forensic specialist. Across the aisle, my father's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Lawson avoided my eyes, studying the floor. Ruth played the recording next. Sienna's voice filled the room, echoing against the wood-paneled walls. "Edward will sign. I just need a copy of Olivia's signature." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Cameras flashed from the press bench. I didn't flinch. I'd heard the tape too many times to feel anything but numb certainty. For a long moment, Judge Lewis said nothing. Then in the stillness, my father rose to his feet, trembling with rage. "This is a farce," he shouted, his voice cracking. "My daughter is trying to destroy me, Mr. Hartley," the judge warned, but he didn't stop. "She's been waiting for this," he said, pointing at me with a shaking hand. "She's always resented me. Everything I built, everything this family stands for. She's tearing it down out of spite." I stood calm and steady. "No, Dad, I'm protecting what this family used to stand for. Truth and integrity. The things you sold the moment you forged my name." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. He stared at me for a long time, his breathing ragged before sinking back into his chair. Ruth spoke softly. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself." Judge Lewis leaned back, folding her hands. "Indeed it does." The next hour passed in a blur of legal arguments and cross-examinations. Lawson's lawyer tried to frame the letters as informal business correspondence, claiming my father had been misunderstood. The judge wasn't impressed. When it was finally over, she removed her glasses and looked directly at us. "The evidence presented clearly establishes intent to commit fraud and a breach of fiduciary duty." Therefore, the court rules that the Ocean View Resort property is lawfully held under the Hartley Foundation Trust. It is protected from sale transfer or collateralization. No party, including Mr. Edward Hartley or his affiliates, has authority over its assets. The sound of camera shutters erupted as the gavel came down. Across the room I saw Julia Bennett, my mother's old friend and a respected journalist, scribbling in her notebook. Later, I'd learn the headline she wrote that day, "The Daughter Who Outsmarted Her Father." As people began to move, I stayed seated. The adrenaline had drained from me, leaving a quiet, almost eerie stillness. Ruth touched my arm. "You won, Olivia." I looked toward my father. He was slumped forward, hands clasped together, staring at the table, as if it might open and swallow him whole. My mother stood behind him, pale, her expression blank, a woman watching the ruins of her life settle into dust. "Does it feel like victory?" Ruth asked softly. I shook my head. "It feels necessary." We walked out into the hallway, greeted by a wall of flashing cameras and shouted questions. "Olivia, do you have a statement? Did you intend to expose your father publicly? Was this revenge?" I kept walking, the noise fading behind me. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky a pale blue, washed clean by the morning. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the hum of traffic, the ordinary life of a city moving on. As Ruth's car pulled up to the curb, she turned to me. "You know, not many people would have had the courage to do what you did." I met her gaze, tired but resolute. "Courage isn't what got me here, Ruth. It was exhaustion. I just got tired of pretending silence was loyalty." She nodded slowly. "That's still courage in its own way." From the corner of my eye, I saw my parents exiting the courthouse. My father clutched my mother's arm, unsteady on his feet. For a moment, he looked up, meeting my eyes across the steps. There was no anger this time. Just emptiness. He turned away first. I stood there for a while, letting the sunlight hit my face, the noise of the reporters fading into the background. For the first time in years, I felt no need to explain myself to anyone. The truth had spoken, and for once, it was louder than the lies. A week later, my family name was still headline material. Every morning, the news anchors said it like a warning. Edward Hartley resigns amid criminal investigation. Hartley Realty under federal scrutiny. Sienna Reed Hartley leaves Los Angeles following scandal. I stopped watching after the third day. The sound of it no longer made me angry. It just made me tired. Ocean View was quieter than usual. Guests had trickled back in, drawn by the promise of privacy, unaware they were walking through the aftermath of a family implosion. The sea breeze carried the same rhythm as always, as if the world had already moved on. That afternoon, I was reviewing renovation plans in the lobby when the front doors opened and Ethan walked in. For a moment, I didn't recognize him. The arrogance was gone. He looked older, his eyes hollow, his shoulders heavy under a wrinkled dress shirt. "Hey," he said quietly. I set the papers aside. "Ethan." He hesitated, then sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, but not hostile, like two people standing on opposite sides of a grave. Finally, he said, "I was wrong." I met his gaze, waiting. "She used me," he continued, his voice unsteady. "Sienna. She said she loved me, that she wanted to help Dad, that we were building something together. But she was just using me to get close to him, to get to you. I didn't see it until after the hearing. I said nothing. Sometimes silence said more than forgiveness ever could." He ran a hand through his hair. "You were right about everything. About Dad, about her, about all of it." "No," I said finally. "I wasn't right. I just stopped lying to myself sooner than you did." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I thought I was protecting the family, but I made it worse. I looked out toward the ocean through the wide lobby windows. "No one protects anyone in this family, Ethan. We just survive each other. That's all we've ever done." He let out a broken laugh. "Maybe so, but you..." He stopped, searching for the right words. "You saved us even if none of us deserved it." I turned back to him. "I didn't save anyone. I just didn't let them destroy what was still real." He nodded slowly. "That's more than I did." For a long moment, we sat in silence again. Then he stood, smoothing his shirt. "I'm going back east. I need to figure out who I am without all of this." I nodded. "That's probably the first honest thing you've said in years." He gave a faint smile, sad but genuine. "Take care of yourself, Liv. You too, Ethan." When he left, I didn't watch him go. Some goodbyes didn't need ceremony. That evening, I received a text from my mother. Just one line: "I've moved to Monterey. I need quiet for a while." I stared at the message for a few seconds, then deleted it. There was nothing left to say. Sometimes silence was the only language left between people who once loved each other. Days passed. The press found a new story, the world found new scandals. Ocean View went on. The tide didn't care who lost their crown. One afternoon, Lydia arrived with my niece Rachel. The teenager bounced through the lobby with a camera slung around her neck, her energy a strange and welcome intrusion. "Wow," she breathed, looking around. "This place is gorgeous, Aunt Liv." "Thank you," I said, smiling faintly. "It's calmer now." She walked to the window, pressing her hands against the glass. "You can see everything from here. The ocean looks different from this side." Different how, like it knows something, she said. Like it's seen people try to own it and just laughs. I couldn't help but laugh softly. That's a good way to put it. Rachel turned back, studying me. "Do you ever regret it? All of this exposing them, losing them?" Her question hung in the air for a long time. Lydia shifted awkwardly beside her, but I answered without hesitation. "No, because truth isn't a crime." Rachel nodded slowly, her young face thoughtful. "Mom says you're brave. I'm not." I said, "I just learned what happens when you stay quiet too long." Outside, the wind was picking up, whipping the surf into white crests. The glass windows rattled softly as the tide grew louder, pressing against the shore like a heartbeat. Later, when they'd left, I walked down to the beach. The sand was cool under my feet, the horizon glowing faintly with the last light of day. The wind tangled my hair, but I didn't brush it back. I let it move freely the way I finally had. The ocean stretched before me, endless, alive, forgiving nothing, yet washing everything clean. I stood there watching the waves rise and fall, each one breaking a little further up the shore, before sliding away again. The storm had passed. What was left wasn't peace exactly, but something better. Clarity. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for someone to call, to explain, to apologize. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 6 months later, the world had learned a new name for Ocean View. The gates that once bore the Hartley family crest now carried a simple silver sign, Hartley Foundation, Design for Tomorrow. The old grandeur had softened into something lighter, more alive. Students from art and architecture programs visited on weekends, sketchbooks in hand, laughing as they walked along the glass corridors. The sound of their voices replaced the silence that had lived here too long. I stood by the front entrance watching a group pose for photos beneath the new logo. Lydia joined me, tablet in hand, smiling. "You've officially gone viral again," she said, half amused. "The Los Angeles Review just named you one of the most inspiring women of the year. Their headline reads, 'The woman who outsmarted her family.'" I smiled faintly. "That's dramatic." "They love drama," she said. "But it's true, you know." I shook my head. "I don't need them to call me clever. I just wanted to keep what mattered." Lydia tilted her head, studying me. "You did that, and you turned it into something better." When she left to greet the next group, I wandered through the newly finished gallery, what used to be my office. The walls were lined with framed photographs documenting the resort's transformation. Blueprints, construction sketches, the first reopening ceremony. But it was the far wall that always stopped me. A single photo hung there, black and white, slightly faded. My family, my father, my mother, Ethan, and me. The 4 of us smiling years before the cracks began. It was the only picture I hadn't taken down. I stood there for a long time studying our frozen faces. We looked happy, but even then I could see it. The distance in my father's eyes, the uncertainty in my mother's smile. It wasn't nostalgia I felt anymore. It was understanding. My reflection appeared faintly in the glass beside them, an echo of the woman I'd become. In the corner of the room sat a small plaque with an inscription Lydia had chosen for the reopening. "Built from truth. Preserved by courage." I traced the words with my finger, the metal cool under my touch. For years I thought justice was about victory, about proving someone wrong. But sitting here surrounded by the quiet hum of what I'd rebuilt, I knew it was something simpler. Justice was survival without shame. Outside, the sun dipped lower, the light turning gold through the tall windows. I walked through the resort one last time before closing for the evening. The restaurant lights flickered on the scent of rosemary and salt filling the air. Guests lingered on the terrace, clinking glasses, unaware that this place had once been the center of a family's undoing. Lydia waved goodnight as she left with the last few students. "See you tomorrow, Liv. Get some rest," I called after her, when the doors closed and the laughter faded. I walked down the path toward the beach. The air was cool, the sand soft beneath my bare feet. The horizon burned orange and pink, the waves whispering in long, gentle breaths. I paused at the water's edge, the hem of my dress brushing against the tide. The ocean had been both witness and confessor to every chapter of my life. It had seen me furious, broken, terrified, and now finally still. My father had lost his company, but not his life. He was living quietly now out of the city, according to Ethan, who called sometimes just to say he was doing better. My mother found a small house in Monterey where she painted landscapes she never showed anyone. And Ethan, he'd started teaching law at a small college in Vermont. He wrote to me once, "Thank you for not giving up on the truth, even when it broke us." I kept his letter in my desk unopened since the day I received it. Some peace doesn't need words to prove it exists. I closed my eyes and let the wind brush across my face. Somewhere behind me, the resort lights came on one by one, warm and steady against the darkening sky. In that quiet, I thought of everything that had been lost, and everything that had survived anyway. My father lost his reputation. My mother found her calm. My brother learned silence, finally. And I stayed. Not to win, not to punish, but to remember. That truth doesn't need noise to exist. The waves rolled in again, soft and certain, wrapping around my ankles like a benediction. I smiled faintly. The storm had taken years to build, and only days to break. But the calm afterward, the calm was mine. I turned back toward the resort, its windows glowing against the twilight. Tomorrow, new guests would arrive, new stories would unfold, and Ocean View would continue. No longer a secret battleground, but a sanctuary built on something honest. And if anyone ever asked what it cost to tell the truth, I would say everything that wasn't worth keeping. If you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been told to stay quiet, remember this. Silence can be the loudest answer. Some gifts can't be returned because they are truth itself. Thank you for listening. Stay with me for the next story, because somewhere another storm is already forming beyond the horizon.